today, topics that could fall within the fields of positive psychology and transpersonal psychology were in fact discussed in many aspects in the Islamic world between the 8th and 16th centuries. And the tradition of ilm al-nafs, the science of the soul, actually developed. This does not occupy a very significant place within mainstream psychology. But they refer to this as indigenous psychology, which they define as local psychologies. They have also included the concept of Islamic psychology. In fact, publications on Islamic psychology have appeared in reputable journals of the American Psychological Association. Many publications have been made. There have also been those who believe that the knowledge produced within the Judeo-Christian tradition is unreliable and should not be used by Muslims, arguing that Muslims do not need this knowledge and that their own cultural heritage is sufficient for them. We can consider this as an exclusionary approach.
Istanbul. Greetings to everyone from the school. Dear viewers, today we will be talking about Islamic psychology. Our guest is Professor Dr. Ali Ayten. Welcome, Professor.
Thanks, yeah. How are you?
Thank you very much. How are you, Professor?
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Professor, once again, Islamic psychology is an important topic. So how is psychology perceived in the Islamic world, if you like? Let's start with this. How does the Islamic world view psychology? When people in the Islamic community encounter psychological situations, how do they respond? What do you think?
Well, as you know, psychology is a science that emerged at the end of the 19th century. Its emergence as a scientific discipline happened then. Of course, even before that, people had psychology, and studies resembling psychology were being conducted within different fields of knowledge. Well, the psychology laboratory in Leipzig, Germany, established in 1879, is considered the starting point. Similarly, in America, William James's initiatives at Harvard University around the same period are regarded as the early years of psychology. While these events were taking place in the world, of course, in the Islamic world at that time, there was the Ottoman Empire, Egypt, Iran, and so on. This was actually followed quite closely. The perception and development of psychology is also closely related to modernization in the Islamic world, because in the Western world, every kind of innovation that emerges is followed by schools and in the field of education. In the Islamic world as well, and in psychology, these developments are followed in the same way. For example, when we look at the Ottoman Empire, we see that in those days, especially towards the end of the 1800s, many translation works were being done in psychology. These are mostly translated in France under names such as Ilmi Ahvali Ruh, Ilmi Ruh, Ilmi Nefs, or as Ruhiyat, Nefsiyat, and so on. Translations have been made from French as well as from German and English. Although it started primarily with translation activities, there were also efforts at localization, and during this period, psychology began to be explored. For example, during the Ottoman era, there are works by Filibeli Ahmet Hilmi. Hoka Tahsin Effendi, for instance, wrote the first book on psychology. Again, towards the end of the 1800s, psychology courses were introduced at Darul Funun, and later on it was transformed into Istanbul University. As you know, in the 1930s, laboratories were established, and Mustafa Shekiptans officially initiated psychology in the Republic of Turkey. While these developments were taking place in Turkey, in Egypt, for example, similarly towards the end of the 1800s, developments in psychology were followed and books were written in this field. In Iran, likewise, a thinker named Ali Akbar Dakoti, for instance, conducted studies in this area. Of course, at that time, countries like Pakistan did not exist yet, but in India, that is where most Muslims lived, they were living under the name of India. Later on, as you know, Pakistan separated In that India as well, studies were conducted and developments in psychology were followed. And during this period, for example, there is a name that we constantly mention in the psychology of religion. For example, Muhammad Iqbal was greatly influenced by William James during that period. He examined the views of Sigmund Freud, drawing inspiration from Hegel and Kant, and also incorporating local Sufi elements. He wrote a book, and the book is titled The Reconstruction of Religious Thought in Islam. He wrote a book that could be translated into Turkish with such a title, and in the field of psychology of religion, in the field of psychology in general, books were being published in his era, and the developments in psychology were being followed by different Muslim countries at that time. Of course, people generally address issues related to psychology, especially problems that fall within the field of clinical psychology through cultural interpretations. That is, mental illnesses are mostly explained by things like the evil eye, magic, or possession by jinn, and local, cultural, and traditional solutions are found for them. Later on, of course, with the development of psychiatry and clinical psychology, gradually going to a psychologist or psychiatrist started to be used as a way to address mental health problems. These kinds of arguments have been used, and people have tried to solve their problems by seeking help from these professionals.
In this way, an acquaintance and association with psychology begins.
Of course.
So how did the concept of Islamic psychology emerge? Who were the pioneering figures in this field?
According to my readings, the first person to use the concept of Islamic psychology was the Egyptian psychologist Muhammad Osman al-Najati, who wrote a thesis on the subject in 1946, a master's thesis. He wrote a thesis titled Sensory Perception in Ibn Sina, Psychological Studies among Muslim Arabs. There is a book version of this thesis. In fact, he is the first person to use the concept of Ilm al-Nafs al-Islami, Islamic psychology, in the year 1946. However, the development of the concept of Islamic psychology, or its becoming more popular and widely used, only emerges after the 1970s, especially with Raji al-Faruqi writing the book Islamization of Knowledge. And that idea being accepted in some countries such as Pakistan, Malaysia, and Iran, and with universities being established to promote that idea. For example, the Islamic University in Malaysia, and as you know, another Islamic university in Pakistan were founded. In these places, as in many other fields of social sciences, an Islamization policy and approach, so to speak, has been adopted in psychology as well. And as a result, the concept of Islamic psychology has come into more common use. And we see that in the Arab world as well, many meetings, symposiums, and books have been produced on this subject. But as I mentioned earlier, the first person to use it was Muhammad Osman al-Najati. And when he first used this concept, that is the concept of Islamic psychology, this is actually what he meant. As you know, in the Islamic world, when the philosophical culture and heritage of ancient Greece were translated into Arabic, the concept of psyche was rendered as nafs in Arabic. And the book Propius, for example, was translated into Arabic as fin nafs, Aristotle's book. In other words, a tradition of the science of the soul began to form. Starting from the 7th and the 8th centuries and from Al-Kindi onwards, we see that many Islamic thinkers such as Avicenna, Ibn Sina, Al-Ghazali, Miskawayh, and Ibn Rushd wrote extensively on this science of the soul. So what are they actually doing here? There is a soul, nafs, that activates the human biological organism, and the soul has its own faculties. And these faculties guide the psychological world of the person. These faculties have their own internal dynamism. This is how they explain it. And this is called the tradition of the science of the soul. The maintenance of these faculties, their deterioration, the problems that arise, their refinement and their maturation. For example, the topic of virtues is introduced in this way, in this field, that is topics that today would fall under positive psychology and transpersonal psychology were, as I mentioned, discussed in many aspects in the Islamic world between the 8th and 16th centuries. And in fact, a tradition of the science of the soul was formed. This is actually what is meant. When Muhammad Usman Nekati uses the concept of Islamic psychology, this is what he's referring to. But in later periods, in the 1970s and 80s, this concept began to be used somewhat differently. It was increasingly perceived as a form of localization, that is, as a way of interpreting emerging psychological theories according to one's own culture. Because, as we just discussed, actually, in other words, two general perspectives towards psychology have emerged in the Islamic world. One of these is an exclusionary perspective. That is, there have been those who believe that the knowledge produced within the Jewish Christian tradition is unreliable and should not be used by Muslims, that Muslims do not need this knowledge, and that their own cultural heritage is sufficient for them. We can consider this as an exclusionary approach. There is also an inclusive approach. That is, there have also been those who argue that the theories produced in the field of psychology, think of Freud, Carl Gustav Jung, Adler, or say Viktor Frankl, and many others can be utilized, but that this accumulated knowledge should be filtered and subjected to a critical perspective. This second group is actually developing the concept of Islamic psychology and, in a sense, investing in it. And this is essentially how the concept of Islamic psychology emerges. As I mentioned, its first use was in 1946. But later on, in the 70s and 80s, it became more widely used. And now it is a concept that is also used in Europe. For example, in 2006, the Islamic Psychology Association was established in the United States. Today, for instance, at Cambridge University, well-known psychologists like Rashid Skinner or Abdullah Rothman, they also say that what they are doing is actually Islamic psychology. So now it is emerging as an approach that is more widely accepted around the world. In fact, at its core, Islamic psychology can be considered a movement of localization. That is because what they actually want to do is to question to what extent the theories produced in the West, mostly based on the Western individual, typically a middle-class white American, explain Muslim individuals. And this approach emerges as a result of such questions or doubts. We can actually call it a localization movement, but in countries like Malaysia, there is also an emphasis on identity. In fact, with the concept of Islamic, there is such an initiative. In Turkey, these have mostly been presented as a localization movement as well. Because, for example, I know some books by professors from Istanbul Psychology. For example, in psychology, I know a book by Sibel Erkonazi called Human Models in Psychology, Our Local Human Model. These topics have also been discussed in Turkey with similar aims, but different names were used. It is mostly seen as a localization in psychology. Actually, this is an inevitable situation because for a science like psychology, which tries to explain human behavior and needs to do so within a cultural context, it is only natural for it to have more local perspectives. Islamic psychology actually has such a journey.
Yes, of course, as you said, it is necessary to differentiate according to people from different cultures and different lifestyles. But Professor, since what we call psychology is already concerned with the soul of the person, with their psychological processes, wouldn't it be more accurate to proceed simply on the basis of being human? What do you think? After all, not just culturally or religiously, but considering that every person is different, a psychological method tailored to each individual should be used in this context.
Of course. I mean, there are universal principles. There are some general theories when it comes to explaining human beings, and what I call this inclusive approach actually encompasses that to some extent. So, for example, can the theories developed by Sigmund Freud, or the theory put forward by Viktor Frankl, or say the theories of Carl Gustav Jung be used to explain a Muslim individual? Of course they can be used. But it's also important to recognize that there are certain cultural and local elements involved. I think we need to pay attention to this aspect. After all, every culture has its own conception of humanity. These conceptions of humanity are somewhat different. For example, the conception of humanity in the Judeo-Christian tradition is somewhat different from that in the Muslim world. Perhaps taking this into account, they developed such an approach. As I said, there are different approaches to this. Some do this specifically under the term Islamic psychology, while others approach it more as localization in psychology. But ultimately, what you mentioned is very important. After all, psychology is a modern science, and the things, results, and findings it has produced can certainly be used in a healthy way by Muslims as well. But as I say, these studies need to be conducted by also taking local elements into consideration.
How does mainstream psychology view this? What is the place of Islamic psychology within mainstream psychology? How is this perceived?
In fact, even in mainstream psychology, we occasionally come across concepts like Christian psychology, Buddhist psychology, Hindu psychology, or Jewish psychology. Of course, these do not occupy a very significant place within mainstream psychology, but they refer to these as local psychologies, what they call indigenous psychology. They have also included the concept of Islamic psychology. In fact, as far as I know, there have been many publications and books prepared on Islamic psychology in reputable journals of the APA, that is the American Psychological Association.
It has gained acceptance?
In other words, these are accepted and evaluated as a local psychology, as an approach.
Well, you mentioned concepts of human nature, Professor. What is the concept of human nature envisioned by Islamic psychology? How does it define it?
Of course, the concept of human nature envisioned by Islamic psychology is actually based on the Quran and the Sunnah. That is, it is based on the verses in the Quran about human beings and the hadiths concerning human nature and structure. When we look at this in the Quran, for example, in the 30th verse of Surah Ar-Rum, it says, "So set your face toward the religion, inclining to truth. Adhere to the fitrah of Allah, upon which He has created all people." When you consider this verse, it speaks of a natural disposition, and in many verses of the Quran, it talks about a human being who has been created. So at the very beginning of everything, when you think about the concept of a human being in Islamic psychology, there is the notion of a created human, that is a created human being, and a being who has a relationship with a supreme transcendent entity. This may be the most fundamental difference in the conception of a human being. Of course, there is a concept of fitrah, innate nature, being pure and uncorrupted. These, for example, give us something, they give us an idea about the conception of the human being in Islamic psychology. Of course, they don't just look at the Quran and Hadith. They also develop this conception by taking into account the theories about human beings developed by thinkers in the Islamic tradition, Sufism, Kalam, and Islamic philosophy. For example, Ibn Sina has a famous saying. He says that within a person there is a seed, a potential for maturation and development, as long as it is not hindered. Think about that statement, for example. This actually gives us an idea about the conception of the human being in Islamic psychology. In other words, when you consider that human beings are creatures with willpower and the potential for self-development, the conception of the human in Islamic psychology is developed not only based on the Quran and Hadiths, but also by making use of the theories that Islamic thinkers have developed about the soul and human nature. Accordingly, studies are being conducted in this field.
The ideas of Islamic philosophers are utilized in understanding the human being.
Absolutely.
So how can we benefit from the practices of Sufis? How would you approach this?
That is, we can benefit from both the ideas of Islamic thinkers and philosophers, from what they have written about the soul, about the science of the soul. These are mostly useful on a theoretical level in terms of the conception of the human being, such as the faculties of the soul and their dynamics. But the practices of the Sufis and those Sufi books, on the other hand, are mostly utilized in the practical field in terms of human education, the psychological and spiritual world, and in developing perspectives on the treatment of these matters. For example, the way Sufis view an illness, how they manage the process of coping with it, and the way they deal with such illnesses can serve as a good example. That is why Sufism is also utilized. For example, in our country, Mustafa Merter's book, The 900-Layered Human, or his books on the psychology of the self, incorporate Sufi literature. And since the author himself is a psychiatrist, he has handled these topics very well. This can be evaluated within this framework. And I personally consider this within the context of Islamic psychology. That's why Islamic psychology has two main pillars. In other words, there is one pillar that is based on Islamic philosophers and their views. And there is another side that draws from Sufi culture, the lives of Sufis and their works.
When we look at contemporary Islamic psychology, can it be said, Professor, that it has brought about a change, a transformation, or an innovation in terms of clinical methods? In fact, I want to ask it this way. In the mainstream psychology, psychotherapy methods that we know, for example, there is a certain method being tried where there is a psychologist, a therapist, and a client involved in the process. Does Islamic psychology introduce any changes here? For example, does it perhaps offer a change, a transformation, or a different method regarding issues like a man and a woman sharing privacy or being together in a therapy room? What do you think about this?
Yes, exactly. Of course, these are mostly done by clinical psychologists. In other words, if people who have received clinical psychology training in psychology adopt this approach, if they adopt the Islamic psychology approach, they develop a new perspective by integrating Islamic viewpoints with therapy techniques from modern psychology. For example, there are methods developed by Abdullah Rothman or Rashid Skinner, who are also clinical psychologists regarding this. They integrate, for instance, cognitive behavioral therapy with an Islamic practice, that is, with an Islamic perspective. And by combining these, they develop a technique. They are conducting these kinds of studies, but these are not things that fundamentally challenge or provide an alternative to the science of psychology, or that would shake its paradigm. In other words, it's not something that would say completely eliminate the therapist-client relationship, as you mentioned, but rather they are trying to establish a system that utilizes Islamic sources a bit more in terms of how to conduct this process.
Well, Professor, thank you very much for your valuable comments.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dear viewers, today we talked about Islamic psychology. See you in the next episode. Goodbye.